Greetings, students. It's week 11. I hope you're doing well. I even trust you're doing well to some extent. It's the final third of the semester, right? So that's exciting. I hope you're feeling it. Hope you're feeling a little excited. This is our second and final week on Leibniz, right? So we get to talk about him more, but then we have to say goodbye. So this week we're talking about his Monadology and the last chapter of a book that he wrote called the Theodicy, right? Last week we discussed the Discourse on Metaphysics, and we're going to start with the Monadology now because it's closely related to the Discourse, which we already talked about last week, right? And so the relation is this. The Discourse begins to articulate a theory of individual substance, and as I said last week, the focus is on agency. How can an individual substance be separate enough from its environment to be a true source of action, right? Rather than just being pushed around by its environment, by everything around it, how can it be a true origin of action, right? That was the focus in the Discourse. So we go into the Monadology knowing that Leibniz is interested in individual substance. Right, he was a well-known guy. People were reading these articles or essays that he was putting out. Publication was different then. He was writing in scholarly journals, but his work was getting circulated. So when he came out with the Monadology, people already knew he was working on individual substance, and so he doesn't make a big deal out of it there, make a big introduction to it, but obviously this is continuous with the work on the Discourse, so if you're familiar, you recognize that pretty quickly. So now he's just using the word monad to refer to an individual substance. Monad, he has taken it from ancient Greek. There's a word monas, and I might not be pronouncing that correctly because I don't know ancient Greek, but it's monas, and it means one or unit or something indivisible. So it makes sense that he would use that term to refer to an individual substance. Okay, and in the Monadology, we're just getting more information about these individual substances. I don't think he's changed his mind about anything, as far as I can tell. We're just seeing further refinement of the doctrine, right? So we get more information about how substances perceive, the nature of their self-sufficiency. How are they self-sufficient? We get more information about how they're coordinated, right? They have these perceptions that are coordinated even though they don't directly interact with each other. There's more information or more theory, if you like, about how that works, either way. And there's more information about bodies and organic bodies in particular. So there's more information, more theorizing about the animal kingdom here, which I find pretty interesting. So in section 3, we'll start there. Leibniz tells us that monads are the veritable atoms of nature, right? So you keep reading and you realize that these monads make up bodies, they make up organic bodies, right? So I'm a cluster of monads. There's I would. It seems that there's one monad sort of coordinating the others, but I am a cluster or a bundle of monads, and so are you. Right? That's the view here. As I said, I don't think Leibniz has really changed his mind about anything. To be clear, and this might have been confusing, so I really want to hit this hard. He's still an idealist. There's a lot of talk about bodies here. As I mentioned, there's a lot of talk about organic bodies. Leibniz is still an idealist. So looking at section 3 still, he says monads are the atoms, the veritable atoms of nature. So everything in nature is made of monads. But in the same section, he says monads have neither extension, nor figure, nor divisibility. So they have no extension, they don't take up space, and everything in nature is made of them. Now you can't put together a bunch of monads that are absolutely extensionless. They have zero extension or zero dimension. However you want to put that. You can't put a bunch of them together and get some extension out of no extension by addition, right? So it still seems to be Leibniz's view here that extension is phenomenal, or he even said in the Discourse, in a way, imaginary. Extension is, in a way, imaginary. I think the word phenomenal works best. That is to say, things appear to have extension. They don't at a deep metaphysical level. They appear to have extension, but that's just how they appear. That's a mode of appearance. I believe I said this last week. Extension is in the same category as something like blue or the scent of lavender. We accept that that's just how things appear to us, and that deep metaphysical properties don't include blue and the scent of lavender, right? Those are superficial things that have to do with the way that we're interacting with other objects, right? There's something in the interaction that causes us to experience blue or the scent of lavender, but those aren't deep properties of things. And Leibniz is putting extension into the same category, clearly because everything is made of monads, and monads are extensionless. And then, as far as figure and divisibility go, Leibniz seems to have the same view as Descartes, which is that figure or shape, in other words, and divisibility depend on extension. So if extension is phenomenal, then clearly divisibility and figure or shape are phenomenal as well, right? They're superficial. They're the way things appear, but not the way things are in themselves, right? So that I hope that makes sense. I think it makes sense. Okay, so monads are individual substances. How are they individuated? Leibniz is retaining the view that each monad is a universe unto itself, in the sense that it contains a view of the universe, right? So each monad certainly has, but I want to make a stronger point, each monad is, in some sense, a perspective on the universe. As I said last week, that perspective is largely created, really, by obscurity. That is to say, I'm an image of the universe, as are you, but I'm finite. So you have to excuse me, my sinuses are wacky. today, and I've restarted this lecture a few times. Can't quite get past the sinus thing, so I'm just having to drink water here. Anyway, each monad is a universe unto itself. It's a perspective on the universe, if you like, but monads are finite, so they don't reflect everything perfectly. And so that's part of how they're individuated. But as we said last time, there's an essence in the individual substance that causes it to do what it does over time. And here we're told the same thing, but there's a little more detail. In section 12, Leibniz says that there must be an individuating detail of changes in each individual monad. What he means is there's a principle in the monad, right? A regulation, a guideline that determines how the monad will change over time. And specifically, it determines how the monad's perceptions will change over time, which again feeds into the idea that a monad is in its essence a perspective of the universe or a reflection of the universe, however you want to put that, right? Okay. These monads, they still don't directly influence each other. My take on that is free will is extremely important to Leibniz. He's trying to build it into the metaphysics here. Now, I've already said you're a monad, I'm a monad, we're all monads. So he just goes all the way, takes it as far as he can, and says monads regulate themselves. They can't be determined to do anything by their environment. They express themselves freely. What we think of as causal influence is really just one monad expressing something that's being expressed next to it by another monad, but that's because of its own internal regulation, right? In other words, I'm a monad, and there's a monad next to me that's really strongly expressing blue. This is a silly example, but this is the kind of thing Leibniz is trying to say. There's a monad next to me expressing blue really strongly. I've been weakly expressing green, but I'm not that attached to it. I'm not that into it. So this monad next to me expresses blue so strongly that I start expressing blue. But the main thing Leibniz wants to say about that is that's according to my own internal regulation, right? That's how I'm designed or built or whatever. If some entity next to me expresses something in this category, maybe a color or whatever it is, very strongly, then I will echo it, because that's my nature, right? So it can't make me do anything, right? It's just according to my own internal regulation. Sometimes I'll start picking up on things in my environment, right? Which I perceive because I perceive the whole universe. So I might start responding to things in certain ways or mimicking things in certain ways. That would just be a specific kind of response. But I do that according to my own internal regulation. In that vein, in section 7, Leibniz makes this famous point that monads have no windows. A monad doesn't have any windows. It contains the whole universe, so he's not saying monads don't perceive what's going on. That can't be the point. The point is this lack of direct influence. Monads act according to their own internal regulation. That's what he means when he says monads don't have windows. However, if you jump all the way to section 78, Leibniz also says the laws of souls or monads agree with each other according to a pre-established harmony. Right? So in other words, there's a larger coherence among the monads. So each acts according to its internal regulations, but what you get in the whole is a coherent pattern that makes sense. Now it looks like a big causal nexus. It looks like this object is causing this object to do this, which is causing this other object to do that, right? I mean, that's what we observe in nature. Remember, Leibniz and Newton are contemporaries, so Leibniz is up on that. He knows the latest physics. He doesn't disagree that that's how the apparent or phenomenal universe works, but he's trying to explain it at a deep level while preserving free will, right? So we're not in a deterministic mechanical universe. That's just the phenomenality. That's just how it appears. But at a deep level, we do what we're self-regulating. That did not come out well. We're acting according to our self-regulation. We're autonomous. We're spontaneous, right? And then that's coordinated. There's a pre-established harmony. There's a congruence in our high-level laws, right? So that I express my individual nature and you express your individual nature and my iPhone expresses its individual nature, to pick a random example. And it looks like a universe of things causing each other to do this or that. That's how it shows up. But that's because of the pre-established harmony. That's because as we express ourselves, we do it in a regulated way, and the regulations themselves cohere because that is how God has ordained it. Okay. That's a lot. I hope that's going down well. You can always put a question into the discussion forum if you want me to say more about that. Okay, so this helps to explain why Leibniz uses some of these other terms to refer to monads. So he calls them incorporeal automata, right? Automata is the plural of automaton. So he's saying they're incorporeal robots or something like that. He also calls them entelechies. What does he mean? How is a monad an incorporeal automata? Or an incorporeal automaton, since that's the singular. How does that, what does he mean by that? He means that, well, it's extensionless, so that's the incorporeal part, right? It's a spiritual substance, you could say, if you needed a term other than incorporeal. And it just operates according to how it's been built, right? What are its basic principles? But it's not going to operate according to the principles of something else. That's the main thing. It's autonomous. So the word automata or automaton suggests autonomy, suggests self-law, self-regulation. So that's what he's trying to say. A monad isn't a robot in the sense that, it does what its designer made it do. It's a robot in the sense that it's got its own internal design that causes it to do what it does. I mean, did God make it? Yes, but when it comes to us, right? God made us with a capacity for choice specifically. So all monads are autonomous and spontaneous, and they act according to their own internal regulation, and then part of our internal regulation is this ability to make choice, and our faculty of choice is basically, in its essence, indifferent. That's still the case. That's something Leibniz took from Descartes, and I mentioned it last week, and that's still the case in the Monadology, that we have some kind of faculty of will or choice that is, by its very nature, indifferent and could go this way or that way. Okay. As far as that term Entelechie goes, that's related to Aristotle, who Leibniz is certainly familiar with, though he'd rather mention Plato. Entelechie is actualization, right? So Aristotle makes a big deal out of the distinction between potential and actuality, or potential and actualization. So in context, Leibniz seems to be saying that monads are self-actualizers, which fits in really well with the other points we've been making. So a monad reaches its own individual perfection. It's driven to do that on its own, right? Again, internally regulated. Okay. Section 15 tells us this more specific point, but in line with what we've already been saying. The changes that occur within a monad, are driven by appetition, which is to say appetite or even desire, right? So monads regulate themselves, their perceptions change over time. Mainly they change because of desire, right? So in a way he's saying something simple. He's saying that I have a desire, and that leads to a change in my perceptions, right? And then I'll probably find, as a result of the change in perceptions, that I'm closer to the object of desire than I initially was, right? So in other words, he's reframing this point that, well, most of what I do based on my desire, and my desire causes me to actually engage with the world and try to get what I want from the world. He's just putting that in an idealist framework, right? He's saying you have a desire shows up, it leads to a change in perceptions, right? How do you experience your body moving through the world? That shows up as a change in your perceptions, right? That's how you register your movement through the world. That's how you know you're moving through the world. And of course, you're trying to change your perceptions in such a way that the object of desire gets closer and closer until finally you attain it, right? So that's generally how monads are regulated. So desire is everywhere in this universe that Leibniz is describing, right? Since monads are everywhere. Section 17 allows us to connect Leibniz's idealism to the mind-body problem. We already suspected he was trying to do something about the mind-body problem, but it's very clear in section 17. This is another famous part of the Monadology. Leibniz basically says, well, suppose you build a thinking, feeling machine. And the point is, that's how Descartes sees organic bodies, as thinking, feeling machines. That's what they seem to be, right? So suppose you build one, right? And you just make it so big that you can go inside of it. So it's like a mill, right? The mill was a common and popular and important technology in Leibniz's time, right? And mills were used for lots of different things. They could draw power from running water, from a current. So you could put a mill next to a river, and that would power the mill. And you could get mills to do lots of different things depending on the design of the mill. But if you went inside, you'd see a bunch of gears, right? You'd see a bunch of material pieces pushing each other around until finally you get a grinder or a masher. Maybe the point of the particular mill is to thrash wheat and get flour out of it. I mean, I don't know a lot about that process, but that's a common use for mills, is to grind down wheat into flour. So anyway, you make this thinking, feeling machine, but at an enormous scale. You go inside the machine. It's by hypothesis, because this is a thought experiment. It's thinking and it's feeling. But what do you see? You see material pieces pushing against each other, right? So if the point is, like, if you looked at a brain, suppose you were able to get into a brain. Either you enlarged the brain or you shrunk yourself. It doesn't really matter which one. You went inside the brain. I mean, what are we dealing with? Ultimately, something mechanical. Molecular machines is the way we would think of it now. But even if Leibniz couldn't see molecules, they didn't have the equipment for that. He's got this idea from Descartes that a brain is a piece of machinery, right? And so that's the point. Here's this thing that's thinking and feeling, and you go inside and you just see a machine. Well, we don't know how that could possibly give rise to thought or perception, right? So what Leibniz seems to be doing is rejecting dualism, right? And clearly in favor of idealism, right? We don't know how a body could cause a mind to do anything. We don't know how a mind could cause a body to do anything. So it's all spiritual substance. It's all mental substance. It's all monads. And that we can make sense of, right? By Leibniz's lights, even a mill, an actual mill, is made of monads. But the reality underneath the appearance is very different from the appearance. So the appearance involves extension and material things pushing each other around. But at a deep metaphysical level, what you get is spiritual substances expressing themselves and sort of harmonizing their appearances according to their own internal regulations. Okay, so that's the famous mill analogy. If somebody ever asks you about Leibniz's mill analogy, now you know. It's an analogy to show that that mind-body divide is impossible. Forget it. Just don't be a dualist. That's the point, ultimately. Don't be a dualist. Be an idealist, like me, Leibniz, right? That's what he's really saying. Okay, so monads are throughout nature. They make up nature. So what we need is different kinds of monads, basically, right? And that's what we get. We get different categories, different kinds of monads. So we're told that there are bare monads, specifically What makes a bare monad? Well, he says sometimes you might be in a stupor, or you might be dizzy or something. He even mentions you might spin yourself around, and then what happens is your perceptions lose distinctness, and you have a hard time making out a particular object in the visual field. Try it. He's right. So sometimes you're in a daze, and when he talks about the bare monad, he's talking about something that's perpetually in a daze. It doesn't have distinct perceptions. So something like a stone, then, right? If you're wondering, like, is a stone sentient in Leibniz's Metaphysics? Yes, but it's not conscious. He does distinguish between perception and consciousness. Not all perceptions are conscious ones. So the stone is in a kind of stupor. It's not really registering its perceptions. It can't really make anything of them. They're not distinct enough. Okay, so that's a bare monad for you. And then there are souls. This is in section 19 now. There are souls whose perception is more distinct and is accompanied by memory. And in section 28, Leibniz mentions brutes, and he says sort of in passing, he's talking about something else, but he mentions that the way that brutes think, which would be non-human animals, to be clear, the way that brutes think is through psychological association and memory, right? So, to give a specific example, a dog might expect the sun to rise, right? When things are dark, the dog might very well have an expectation that light will come again. That seems plausible. I mean, I'm not really sure, but that's Leibniz's view, and it makes sense, right? There's a conditioning there. He doesn't use the word condition or conditioning because the theory of conditioning comes after Leibniz, but in a way, the world conditions us to expect light to follow darkness. So I think this is right. I think animals have something like an expectation that the sun will rise again when it's night, right? Anyway, that's Leibniz's view. And that's because they've associated night with day, right? And their memory allows them to make these associations, right? And they, if you want to take it a little further, they associate the nighttime with a cooler environment and a more quiet environment. But long term, that's associated with the sun coming up again and things getting louder and more vibrant and more creatures coming awake and making more noise. There's a rhythm of life that creatures are conditioned to expect, right? And that much makes a soul. So there's a bare monad, and then there's a soul. If something is able to form psychological associations and has a memory, then it can have a soul. So plants maybe are still bare monads. I'm not going to get into a huge discussion about plants here. There's interesting new data on them, but I'm going to leave it alone. The traditional view has been that plants don't have conscious memory per se. Right? I mean, when we're dealing with a soul, we're dealing with something that's conscious. When we're talking about psychological associations, we're talking about things that happen in consciousness, right? So there's a bare monad, there's a soul which has consciousness, psychological associations, memory. I don't think a plant rises to that level, but I'm not going to argue about it. Somebody might have that view. And then there are spirits. In section 29, Leibniz tells us that a spirit is distinguished by its knowledge of eternal truths, truths that last forever, and it has knowledge of God, right? So here's where the example of the sun rising is helpful again. A soul could expect the sun to rise, but couldn't reason out why it's going to rise again tomorrow. A spirit can reason it out. That is to say, a spirit can have a theory of how the solar system works and can tell you why the sun rises every day in terms of that theory, right? So that's part of having access to eternal truths. You can use math and you can use inference. This follows from that. You can use these things to build theories, and so you can give an account of why the sun rises or why it sets or whatever. Okay, so that helps us distinguish between spirits and souls, and obviously I'm a spirit and you're a spirit, right? And then that's supposed to be the difference. So a soul is conscious of its environment and can navigate its environment. A spirit is conscious even of things that don't have a phenomenal appearance, like eternal truths and like God. All right. I think this is already sounding like Margaret Cavendish, but I think it gets more extreme when you look at sections 65, 66, and 69. Taking those all together, those sections tell us that life is everywhere, even in the smallest particle of matter. Monads can't be generated and they can't be destroyed. And that's the usual take on substance, right? Is that substance can't be generated or destroyed. I mean, in Descartes, there were finite substances, if you like, but extension on the whole couldn't be created or destroyed. There was just a set amount of extension. And then, speaking of Cavendish, it was her view that everything was matter and it was infinite, and it just moved around, right? We believe in the conservation of matter. More generally, philosophers have believed in the conservation of substance. Substance isn't generated or destroyed. So that's what Leibniz believes about monads. They're just so basic, right? They don't get created or destroyed. They get reorganized sometimes. So the seeds of life exist throughout the universe, and given the right opportunities, those seeds begin to develop into life, right? So even when you're looking at gestation in particular animals, Leibniz is going to say, well, the seeds are everywhere, but if you get a certain female of a certain species and these events occur, then what happens is that makes conditions right for life to emerge, right? I already said this with respect to Cavendish. There's not a great understanding here of how life is possible based on the science of the time. So it makes some sense for Leibniz to just claim it's everywhere, right? any bit of matter has life in it, and that life could grow, could be triggered to grow. Okay, so that's the view. In section 71, we get this specific point that a thing's nature is determined by its form, which isn't surprising. That sounds like what he was already saying in the Discourse. But now, again, there's more detail. He mentions that matter is in flux all the time. So a monad does have to be attached to a body, which is just a configuration of monads, of course. But a monad has to be attached to a body to have a perspective on the universe, but it doesn't have to be tied to the same body over time. That requirement wouldn't make sense because bodies are in flux. Right? Matter goes in and out of the body, but as it comes into the body, it takes on the form. Right? So the form determines how the material is going to behave. So Leibniz isn't that explicit, but it would seem that these bare monads, right, if they're in proximity to spirits or souls and the right events occur, these bare monads start expressing the form of the organism. Right? I mean, the way we would put that materially is I ate a Snickers and now it's part of me. But the way that Leibniz would express the same thing is there were some bare monads and they got in the proximity of this particular organism, and then those bare monads, started expressing the form of that organism. That's how he would put the same point, right? So it's all done in an idealistic way. The form is determining everything, not the matter, because matter just is bare monads anyway, right? Okay, we're getting close to the end of what I want to say about the monadology. The last thing I want to say, it has to do with God, so it's a good segue into the Theodicy. In section 32, Leibniz introduces the principle of sufficient reason. So he says there are two principles that govern our thinking. There's the principle of non-contradiction, and there's the principle of sufficient reason. And I assume you know what non-contradiction is. If you believe A and not A, you've got to give one up. Once you recognize that you're in a contradiction, you're going to have to give up one of those two propositions that are contradicting each other. Okay, so that's the principle of non-contradiction. And then the principle of sufficient reason tells us that nothing is arbitrary, or again in more detail, for any fact or for any truth, there's a sufficient reason that it's so and not otherwise. We often don't know what the sufficient reason is, but the principle of sufficient reason tells us that there is a reason, whether we can determine it or not, which does seem to be something we believe intuitively. I'm not going to get into whether the principle of sufficient reason is basically correct. It's a rationalist principle, I can tell you that. It's a principle that assumes the universe makes sense, I can tell you that. In any case, the principle of sufficient reason is something we intuitively believe, because when we are presented with a fact or a truth, we do tend to want to know, why is it like that? How is it like that? We don't assume arbitrariness or randomness, certainly not right off the bat, right? So, speaking of God, Leibniz uses the principle of sufficient reason to establish God's existence. How does that work? Basically, you look at the material universe. It has this history to it, right? So things are just so because things were a different way moments ago, right? And then that led to the current state of affairs according to rules that we have some grasp of, right? Why was the universe like that a moment ago? Because a moment before that, it was this other way, right? And that led to how it was a moment ago, which led to the present. So the point is, when you wonder why the universe is the way it is, you start looking at the history of it, right? A led to B, led to C, led to D, right? So here I have to rephrase what Leibniz is saying a little bit, just to make it pithy. The point is, you could either say, you look at the history of the universe and there was a point when it began, and that initial point is the cause of everything else. So that's the sufficient reason there, is that the universe was brought into being at a certain point in a certain state, right? And so you need God the creator there, right? God the necessary being, right? So these states of the universe, they're contingent in the sense that they're dependent on other things. So they don't sufficiently explain themselves until you say, oh, but God brought it into being, and God necessarily exists because his existence is built into his essence, right? I mean, that was a common view, and that was Leibniz's view at least. It's part of God's essence to exist, right? Okay, so that explains how the universe could conceivably get going. And so then each contingent state of it has an ultimate explanation, which is God made it this way at this point in time. Or the alternative is the universe is eternal, but then you've got this infinite string of contingent states of the universe. And according to the principle of sufficient reason, there should be an explanation why that particular string of contingencies exists. It can't explain itself, right? This infinite string of contingencies is itself contingent. But if you bring in the necessary being that has to exist, you can say that necessary being determined that the string would look like this rather than any alternative, right? Which fits in line with Leibniz's view that you're aware of already from last week, that God considered alternatives when creating the world and made the best possible world that could be made, right? Of course, because God's infinitely good and free, and so anytime there was room for a choice as to how to construct the universe, God made the best choice, right? So that would certainly explain this infinite line of contingencies if you can wrap your head around infinity to begin with. So there is that issue. Okay, so that's an interesting, I mean, it's beyond Leibniz. So that's Leibniz's view. He uses the principle of sufficient reason to establish that there's a God, but also that's a classic argument for God that goes back at least to Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas doesn't state the principle of sufficient reason, but Aquinas does talk about how some things are contingent and some things are necessary. And you can't use contingent beings to give a complete, satisfying explanation of other contingent beings. at some point you have to appeal to a necessary being, right? So Leibniz knows his Aquinas and knows Aquinas wrote that, and Leibniz is putting it in his own terms by espousing the principle of sufficient reason, and so fitting in this proof of God with his own take on rationalism. Okay, and then there's Leibniz's Theodicy. I haven't left myself a ton of time here. I feel like I need to hurry through the Theodicy. So this is a term, that Leibniz coined. The term Theodicy didn't exist before Leibniz, but it has this specific meaning now, which is a sort of justification of God. Right? You look at the universe and you wonder whether a perfect being could have created it. And Theodicy is a justification, or I would say apologetics, right? There's a whole branch of theology called apologetics that the Theodicy seems to fit into. So apologetics, again, is a justification. In other words, there's a problem. You can't have apologetics unless there's a problem. So there, in theory, a perfect God created the universe. But what about this? And apologetics is addressing these problems that crop up. So here is the most classic one. I would say it shows up as Objection 1 in the Theodicy, and in the physical book. This is on page 537. I'll go ahead and read this first argument, this first objection. Number 1, whoever does not choose the best course is lacking either in power or knowledge or goodness. Number 2, God did not choose the best course in creating this world. Number 3, therefore God was lacking in power or knowledge or goodness. Leibniz is putting this in his own terms. He's always thinking about God creating the best possible universe out of multiple possibilities. So he's putting it in terms of the best course. But basically, you could state the classical argument this way. God is supposed to be all-powerful, all-knowing, and perfectly good, and yet there's evil in the universe. Or in other words, there's unnecessary suffering in the universe. Therefore, God doesn't exist. God in the sense of something all-powerful, all-knowing, perfectly good. That is to say, if there's suffering in the world, either God didn't know about it or wasn't powerful enough to prevent the suffering, or isn't perfectly good and didn't care about the suffering, right? I mean, that's the classic way to put the argument. But Leibniz's way makes sense too, of course. So Leibniz's response here is to say, look, the existence of evil or suffering is compatible with God's having taken the best course of action, and that's because there are trade-offs to be made, right? So it's good to have a universe. You probably have a sense, unless you're depressed or something, you have a sense that your own existence is a good thing, right? So what Leibniz is saying is existence is overall good. You know it, I know it. Trade-offs had to be made. So at least, and this is, by the way, how apologetics often works, it's at least compatible with the existence of evil in the world to say that God took the best course of action. In order to make the two items compatible, you just have to say, trade-offs had to be made in order to get these good things, especially free will, you had to allow these bad things, right? So apologetics often involves reconciling things. It's not pure philosophy, which is not necessarily a bad thing. When I think about what philosophy is, I think about starting from first principles. Here are our most plausible principles. We'll build from here. That's not how apologetics works. Apologetics says, well, here's this belief and here's this phenomenon. How do we hold on to the belief in the face of the phenomenon? We'll posit this third thing. That's the typical move in apologetics. So that is different from what we generally think philosophy is. So that's part of why I said this is really a branch of theology. Objection 2 raises the issue of whether there is more evil than good in the world. I'm not going to unsnarl all these objections, or I'm not going to try to rebut all these objections. I'm just going to say a little something about them. So in response to this idea that maybe there's more evil than good in the world, we get two main points, or at least 2 points that I think are interesting for us. The good of non-rational creatures should count. Leibniz is really pro-animal here, right? They have souls, they have an inner life, their perspective matters, they have a good that they pursue, they have value in themselves, right? So is there more evil than good in the world? Well, you better take the animals into account, and their existence seems like a good thing, and they're pursuing their own goods in their own ways, so good for them, right? But here's maybe the more philosophically interesting point. This gets close to Kant's view, I would say. So when we talk about the non-rational animals, that's an issue of quantity. Leibniz is willing to say maybe quantity overcomes quality there, right? Because spirits are still higher than souls. There's still a hierarchy here. But then looking just at spirits, looking just at rational beings, maybe there's a case in which quality overcomes quantity. That is to say, when you look at someone whose will is pure and who does the good thing for the sake of doing the good thing, that might be more valuable, than the disvalue created by any number of people doing bad things. And what it seems to come down to is, Leibniz isn't very clear on this, but when people do bad things, it's often because they just do what they feel like doing. It's not a strong act of will. It's just they're often giving in to an inclination or a feeling. So when people behave badly, it is often out of weakness, and at least we could understand and we could sympathize, and so that's not as much disvalue as it could be. They weren't evil on principle, but to be good, we think conventionally involves doing what's good because it's good. That's something Kant very much agrees with. So if you get a truly good action with a good intention behind it, the value there is much greater than the disvalue of a lot of bad actions. I mean, that's basically what Leibniz is saying, or in other words, quality overcomes quantity in this case. When you're talking about the goodness of the animals, it's quantity overcoming quality. When you're talking about one pure good act of will being more important than 20 or whatever bad acts, that's quality over quantity, right? And they're both important. Leibniz is able to reconcile it and make it work. Objection 4 raises the issue of whether God is an accessory to sin. That's a pretty serious charge. Is God an accomplice in our sins? So there we get an interesting distinction between the antecedent will and the consequent will. So Leibniz has other ways of putting the same distinction, but let's go with this phrasing. So there's the antecedent will, that is to say, God wills a good universe. Like it's this big general initial intention that God has, right? And then foresees down the line, Bob is going to rob a convenience store and somebody's going to get shot. Well, God is making the universe knowing that that will happen, but that's not the antecedent will, that's the consequent will. In other words, God's allowing the universe to go forward, knowing that's a consequence, but he's not directly willing Bob to rob the convenience store, and he's not directly willing for someone to get shot in the process. He's willing a universe that's overall good. It's the best universe he could come up with. It's not his fault. He's making finite beings, and we're limited. We've got our limitations. So, anyway, God's not an accessory, is the point, ultimately. Because if you want to know what God wills, look at the antecedent will. The consequent will is just God making allowances so that the good thing can exist. So that doesn't make him an accomplice, right? Especially given our discussion last week, where we said, well, God foresees your actions, so are you free or not? Well, you're free because you're doing what you want to do in the moment, and doing the opposite doesn't involve a contradiction. So you could do something else if you wanted to do something else, right? At least that's Leibniz's response, right? So we'll leave it at that. We're trying to hurry now. Objection 5 raises the issue of whether God is the cause of sin. So that's pretty close to objection 4. Not surprisingly, perhaps, Leibniz claims that sin results from privation, right? There's a lack of goodness. So this is similar to Descartes' Meditation 4, although Descartes was focused on error and was trying to avoid talking about sin specifically. But it's the same idea. It's just, well, we're finite. So God gives us some amount of goodness and wisdom, but we can't contain all of God's goodness and wisdom. We're limited. I like this image he gives of a laden boat, right? So you got a boat going down stream, being driven by the current, but it's got a load. It's laden, right? So the current is moving it, but the load is to some extent determining how much of the current it can pick up, how much energy it can actually get from the running stream, right? So it's something like that. I like the image. God's trying to put all this goodness and wisdom in us, but we can only bear so much. Eventually we'll sink if you laden us too much, right? So yeah, we're just gonna carry a certain load, and it's gonna interact with the current, and we'll not be able to fully benefit from the speed the current is going at. We'll just pick up on some of that motion. So yeah, I mean, the reason we go wrong is just a lack of goodness and a lack of foresight and a lack of wisdom. Right. If we were unlimited in our goodness, obviously we'd do better, right? To make it a little more specific than that, in other words, we have these inclinations pushing us around and buffeting us, like I want this and I want that, and Maybe I want money to get these other things that I want. And so we have this finite point of view, and we're trying to make these decisions about which inclination to go with. And we might make a bad myopic decision, right? It doesn't really, this again is Kantian, it doesn't really leave room for just willful badness. There doesn't seem to be much room for that in the moment that you choose. You're choosing what looks good to you. So you're trying to follow the good. But your view of it is very limited because of your finitude. Okay, objection 6 states that some people are unjustly punished because they must sin. Right. This again is the idea that God foresees everything, so it was always going to happen, so some people must sin. But Leibniz says, he doesn't just bring up what he brought up last time, which is why I'm bothering to mention it. He says, God gives sufficient aid and grace to those who have goodwill. Right, so there's an interesting view that you kind of meet God halfway. You've got to have a good intention, right, and then God will lend you some aid and some grace so that you can actually realize your intention. If you want to avoid sin, God can help you avoid sin, right? But then another problem arises, which is objection 7. Objection 7 suggests that some people get the resources they need to have a goodwill in the first place, and some don't. Right? So objection 6, in responding to that, Leibniz says, well, God will give you the aid and the grace that you need if you have goodwill. And objection 7 then is saying, well, not everybody has goodwill, and why hasn't God allowed them to have goodwill? I mean, he's all-powerful, so why didn't he just give them goodwill? And the answer is something you still hear from theologians. I mean, this is something C.S. Lewis brings up in his book On Pain, for instance. God created a good order. The universe is well ordered. In order to make everybody have a good will all the time, God would have to perform miracles all the time. That's just not what he set out to do. He set out to make a good universe that governs itself. Right? It has generally good results, but it allows some people to not have goodwill some of the time. And that's good, right? I mean, it's good to have a universe that overall works and has good results, and it's good that it can sort of run on its own without God performing miracles every moment. I mean, that makes sense as far as it goes, although you kind of wonder if we're putting an aesthetic good over a moral good in that kind of case. I'll leave you to think about that, right? Certainly a universe that runs itself is cool. We're pleased by it, but that seems like aesthetics. That seems a little superficial. People actually doing bad things because they don't have a good will, they don't have good intentions, that's a moral issue. So, I don't know, that seems problematic if we're favoring aesthetic considerations over moral considerations. But I'll leave it at that. Finally, objection 8. God is not free, since he must will what's best. Right? There's an interesting little conundrum. By convention, by common understanding, God is good, perfectly good, and free. Right? And so is there a contradiction there? It seems like God must be good, so then God isn't free. Leibniz thinks That's silly. And again, here he sounds Cartesian, because he says, well, what's more free than being able to pursue the good without impediment? That's the best kind of freedom you can have. Nothing gets in your way as you try to pursue the good. So God is free, because God can pursue the good without any mental coercion, without any external physical coercion. Nothing stops God from pursuing what's perfectly good. So God is free in that sense. However, God is not indifferent. Not that Leibniz says that clearly, but Descartes does, actually. So that has to be the view here, right? I mean, our will is essentially indifferent, but that's connected to our finitude, right? If we saw better what was good, we wouldn't really have that experience of indifference. So God is free, but not in the sense of indifference. God has a higher kind of freedom, which again is the lack of impediment in pursuit of the good. Okay. I'm sorry if this lecture, I don't know, sounded funny. And like I said, I've got sinus problems and just tried to power through. And it's a little long, but the feedback I got with regard to the last lecture is just do it all in one lecture, because then I only have to cite one lecture in my discussion post. And so, okay, this is just one lecture, even though we're talking about both the Monadology and the Theodicy in the same lecture. I'm just responding to what you've told me, and if other students have a different view, they should let me know in the discussion forum. All right, thanks a lot.